Hi guys, and welcome back to the Brontë Book Club. For the entirety of this year, I am running the Brontë Book Club as part of my role as Brontë Society Young Ambassador to celebrate Emily Bronte's bicentenary year, and these videos are all sponsored as part of that role. And today I'm going to be discussing the Brontes and the imagination. I think when we think about the Brontes, we think about Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights or even The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, but we don't often think about the juvenilia, the books that they wrote when they were younger that consist of thousands and thousands of words of writing, more so than the books that we know them best for. So today I want to consider the role of their writings when they were younger and what part they played in their later lives. You don't have to delve deep into the lives of the Brontes to find out about their little books. These were tiny scraps of paper that they made into books that they wrote in minuscule font that you can't read without using a magnifying glass, and they were set in their fictional worlds. And this all started with a group of toy soldiers that their father, Patrick, bought for Branwell, and each of the siblings had their own soldiers, and together they created a world called Glasstown and Angria. And one of my favourite elements of their early writings is the way they would insert themselves into the stories. They were gods, they called themselves genii, and they would control the world as if they themselves were characters looking down on this world that they created. So it's like they are the people and then they are also characters, and those characters also control other characters within the story that they are creating. And there were no rules to their early stories, so they would kill off a character only to resurrect them in another piece of writing that they wrote at a later date. There were supernatural elements, there were awful characters who did very awful things. They killed people, and there were alcoholic characters and drug takers, and they are very young children writing about very mature subjects. And they took great inspiration from a periodical at the time called Blackwood's, and they would get the magazine and they would devour it. And I see this as an early form of imitation, and you see if you go to the Brontë Parsonage Museum that on display there are artwork that the Brontë siblings would copy. So they take the original and then they would make it their own, and this was a way that girls would develop their art. And it was seen at the time that boys and men could create their own original artwork, but it was more the women's domain that they would copy other people's artwork and make it their own. And I see that the Brontes juvenilia is a way that they are doing the same, but instead of doing it through drawing or painting, they are doing it through writing. In their writing, Charlotte and Branwell would try to outdo each other, to make outrageous things happen to each other's characters. Sometimes they didn't agree with this, and it's a very interesting back and forth atmosphere between the events happening within the stories. But we can see from the existing writings we have from Emily and Anne that their atmosphere within the juvenilia was slightly different, and they decided to go a different direction. And this was when Gondal was created. Gondal was Emily and Anne's fictional universe. It's slightly different between Glasstown and Angria, which was very much inspired by African roots. But Gondal is far more reminiscent of the Yorkshire moors that the Brontes lived on. And one of my favourite pieces of the Brontë juvenilia is when Charlotte, through her characters, goes to Emily's place that she governs in the Glasstown universe and comments on how different it is to the places that Charlotte's character is used to. And I think that through that piece of writing we can see that Emily was peeling off in a different direction than Charlotte wanted her to go on, and that Charlotte and Branwell were going down. And so then you get these two different universes that have very different characters. Charlotte's ultimate hero in life was the Duke of Wellington, and the Brontes were born just after the Napoleonic Wars ended, and you can definitely see his influence on the characters, not just because they are named after him and his family, but also because Charlotte takes on this idea of the Byronic hero. And I think that the Byronic hero is tied into this war hero, chivalrous nature, these characters who do wonderful things, these mighty acts of war heroism. And Charlotte definitely goes down that route, whereas Emily goes down a different route, and one of her main characters in her juvenilia is a character called Augusta G. Almeida, and she is, I think, the female version of the Byronic hero. And for those of you who don't know what I mean by the Byronic hero was a character trope created and idealised by the work of Lord Byron, and you can definitely see his influence in all of the Brontes' works. But I think that the way in which Charlotte and Emily interpret the Byronic hero is very different. Charlotte channels it through her love of the Duke of Wellington and the characters she creates in her juvenilia that are mainly male, whereas Emily channels the Byronic hero by creating a female character who does outrageous things, who has many relationships with many different men, who doesn't always make the right decisions. And I think it's very interesting how the two create the same character but very different versions of that character. I'm very interested in how we perceive the juvenilia, whether we see it as equal to the Brontes' later works that they published, or whether we see them as lesser works that aren't as important to their overall stories or their history. But I am of the opinion that the juvenilia is as important as Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights, and particularly with Emily, I think that her poetry is just as important, if not more important, than Wuthering Heights. Emily was writing, for example, in her fictional world of Gondal from when she was a teenager right up until her death. So to consider it just juvenilia, things that she wrote when she was younger, I think does it a disservice and discredits it as a very important piece of the English canon. I also think that to discredit the Brontes' early writings as lesser works is to ignore the huge influence that it had on their lives. And when Charlotte came to grow out of the Glasstown and Angria saga that she created something called Farewell to Angria, which was a piece she wrote exploring her feelings about letting go of it. And she said, "It is no easy thing to dismiss from my imagination the images which have filled it so long. They were my friends and my intimate acquaintance, and I could with little labour describe to you the faces, the voices, the actions of those who peopled my thoughts by day, and not seldom stole strangely even into my dreams by night. When I depart from these, I feel almost as if I stood on the threshold of a home and were bidding farewell to its inmates." And I love that image of the world and the characters that Charlotte had created with her siblings, inhabiting her head by day and by night, in her waking hours and in her dreams. It's something more than just some writing that she used to develop her writing. It is a whole other world, and I see this as an early form of fan fiction, which I think is a really interesting thing to consider, because we see fan fiction now as something that is knocking off other people's writings. It's seen as a lesser thing, but the Brontes were taking things that they'd already read. For example, Branwell would write in a similar style to things that he'd read in the Blackwoods periodical, and he would take that style and use it in his writing. And they create characters that are based on real people, but they make them their own. And it is a way of developing their writing, but it also becomes a hobby and a pastime and something that they use to get through their day. We can also see this attachment in Emily and Anne's diary papers when they talk about the world of Gondal that they have created in a way that is exactly equal to their everyday life. So in one instance, Emily talks about the things that they've been doing at home, and then she talks about something that's happening in the Gondal saga, and then she goes back to talking about something else that has happened at the parsonage. But she doesn't talk about the world of Gondal as if it is something that she is exactly working on or something that isn't a natural thing for her to be doing. They are equal in her mind, and I love that. The other thing that I love about Emily and Anne's poetry, as opposed to their novels, is that they wrote their novels in order to be published. But with their poetry, you feel like you're looking at their private lives, their intimate thoughts, the things that they think through their characters that you don't quite get with a novel that is there to be published. So with a novel, you are kind of performing. It's a way of getting your thoughts out and creating a story that you know that other people are going to read. But with their poetry, you get the sense that they are writing it because they want to get the story out on the page, and because it's something that is living in their heads, rather than because they want to use it as a way of exhibiting it in any form. And for me, the thing I love most about the Brontes' younger writings is that they have a youthfulness and almost a naivety about them. They aren't writing it because they want ambitious things. They're writing it because they love it, and they're writing it at a time when they can't even comprehend the things that are going to later happen in their lives. Branwell at this time hasn't spiraled off into an opium and alcohol habit, or they haven't been split up and gone their different directions, becoming governesses and going to Brussels. They're living their lives, these intimate lives that we get a sense of what they were like when they were younger. We're seeing into their heads, and that's what I love most about them. So I'd love to know in the comments if you've ever read any of the Brontes' juvenilia, any of the books that they wrote set in their fictional worlds, and what you thought of them. And I will see you next time for my discussion on Emily's complete poems. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. Happy reading!